This. We need to talk about this. This was dropped in my inbox and I haven't read it, but then I read the headline and then I heard that former Belarusian people in this Belarusian security apparatus, we're talking like their version of the CIA, police officers, riot cops, they're working in Poland to try to undermine the Belarusian regime, Lukashenko's regime, and collapse it. Let's read a little bit about this. This is fascinating. A group of Belarusian dissidents say they are planning a coup against the country's authoritarian ruler, Alexander Lukashenko, to be executed at the right time. The partisan resistance group Bipol, which operates from Poland, has been training officers and actively sabotaging the Kremlin in its war against Ukraine, all in preparation of a coup d'etat against the Minsk regime, one senior figure said publicly. We have worked out a plan that will put into effect at the right time, former Belarusian officer Alexander Azura told Belgian media. According to Azura, ensuring Russian President Vladimir Putin's defeat in Ukraine is necessary to weaken the Lukashenko regime. Without Putin, there is no Lukashenko. If Ukraine can launch a successful offensive, Putin will no longer have time for Belarus. Now, this is the thing that interests me, is out of all the people of the world, Lukashenko is the one who wants the war to end like no time soon. There's so much speculation. Oh, the Russians want this war to keep going. I would say from their pushing in of Divka and Rabatne and other locations to high casualties, trying to take advantage of the ammo depletion, they want this war to end sooner rather than later if they can, because there's a lot of externalities that they just plain can't control for, and there's problems with the economy, problems that are bubbling up in society, problems with troop mobilization and the possible backlash if they do it, problem with troop rotation, the problem with with mobilizing the war economy, problem with the fleeing of Western capital, sanctions tightening. They have a bunch of reasons why, if they could end the war tomorrow, even at high cost, that they might be willing to do that. That's why I think they're willing to lose so many men. When you go into the Ukrainian side, obviously, the Ukrainians don't want this war to keep going forever. They might keep fighting to the future, of course, but they don't want this war to go on forever because they don't like the death. They don't like the destruction. It's their country getting bombed. The West, they don't want this war to keep going on forever because there's a domestic political component to it that's becoming particularly tricky. There's a problem when it comes to, the cost, as many European powers don't like the amount of money they're spending on the war in Ukraine, even if there's definitely an argument about investing in Ukraine now so you don't have to invest in a bigger conflict later, or in trying to match the Russians later if they move on from Ukraine. They still would like the war to be won or done quicker so they don't have to spend these costs. And of course, there's the ever-present threat of nuclear weapons. So I would say for everyone, if they could end the war sooner rather than later, for everybody involved as well, in victory, then they would. There's one character where I don't think that's the case, and it's special. And it's Lukashenko. Lukashenko is in a precarious position because historically, when Lukashenko took over the young Belarusian democracy and then centralized it around himself to create an autocracy, he would play this balancing act between the West and the East, where for a bit he would have Putin come up and he'd be like, oh, it's time to, centralize more with the Russian state, and we're going to make greater Russia one day, and Belarus is going to be part of that, and we need to do this and do that. And he'd get nervous about Putin taking over his power structure, and so he'd lean towards the West. And then Putin would get mad, try to be dragging him back over, and then the Westerners, as he's leaning more their way, they'd say, oh, well, in the next election, we really hope you have international monitors, and we hope you do this, and we hope you do that. And then Lukashenko's like, democracy, and then it comes going the other way. It's not only democracy, but one of the components. And then you do this on repeat, kind of playing one side against the other to try to get more aid from the Russians in order to drag them back from the West, and then try to get more aid from the West or more assistance from the West and trade from the West in order to drag them back. And just go back and forth, back and forth. Some people compare it to Tito, even though I think Tito was a lot more competent in it. But what happened was there was this election back in, and I don't think it was 2020. I forget exactly what it was. I think it was 2020. It was an election in 2020 where the security services brutally cracked down on protesters after it was shown that he probably isn't as popular as the election data showed, and there's a good case for election fraud. And then the opposition leaders were getting cracked down upon, protesters were getting killed, and it got really, really, really bad. And that's when he relied on the Russian army to come in and save his ass. And 2 years later, after he kind of, in a way, burn a lot of bridges with the West. That is when the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, with him tied more to the Russians due to him being in that weak domestic position at the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with Belarus then becoming a launching pad for the war. And the Russians might have, and we don't know all of the dynamics, might have been requesting for the Belarusians to get more involved, send troops. We don't know, even though there seems to be a decent amount of domestic opposition to that idea. Lukashenko is in a position where, and this is what makes him different from a lot of other people, if the war was to end in a Ukrainian victory, he'd be very difficult. He'd be in a very difficult place, because if Putin goes under and one of his power backers go under and he doesn't have a lot of domestic support, and there's other people like this outside of the country trying to bring about his downfall, the system of government, which he was like trumpeting, you know, balancing between two sides and backed up by Putin, you know, if the Russian economy can't support him with aid and other things, then that's going to hurt the domestic Belarusian economy, and he's going to be in a worse negotiating position with the West. The West is not going to have any reason to prop him up, and Lukashenko might be looking at the end of his regime because he doesn't have the Russians to back him up. The West has no reason to give him any, you know, leeway, and his economy is going to be in a really tough spot. Not to mention there, of course, is going to be domestic questions about the war and the result of it, who is responsible. And so that could very well be the end of his regime, and certainly the end of a lot of leverage. But on the other end of the spectrum, let's say the Russians win. Let's say the Russians win in the most dominant way possible and take over all of Ukraine. Well, during the war, Lukashenko has a lot more leverage against the Russians than during peacetime. Belarus is used as a launching pad for rocket strikes, and during the start of the war was used as a launching pad for direct attacks. Even if I think like 13,000 Russian soldiers were redeployed to other areas, most likely to be funneled into the offensives near the front in the east, they still need Belarus in order to conduct the war, either for logistics, for stationing nuclear weapons to posture against the West, for diplomatic posturing, for all sorts of things. They need the Belarusians right now to strategically box in the Ukrainians and as a launching pad. And that's why during the course of this war, the Belarusians, even if just during 2022, he needed Russian security forces to be sent into his country to murder his own people to prop up his regime, in 2024, going into this year, he's being funneled aid, he's being funneled money, he's being given favorable trade agreements, because the Russians want to keep him happy. Because if they keep him happy, then they keep him subservient to their war goals, and that's one less trouble that Putin has to worry about. Because the last thing Putin needs right now is another security crisis. Let's say Putin was to get angry at Lukashenko's demands and say, screw you, I'm not going to protect you, and the Lukashenko regime crumbles during the war. Well, not only have they lost a launching pad for invasion, not only would the Ukrainians have less reason to have forces stationed on the border and might be able to redeploy them to other areas of the front, but with chaos in Belarus, that chaos could possibly spell into Russia. There is, and the Russians like to talk about this a lot of interconnectedness between Belarus and Russia, both economically, culturally, and amongst its populations, as there's been intermarriages and stuff like that. And so if that regime starts to crumble, Russians might start asking, well, what about our regime? Not to mention the instability is just generally not going to be good for them. So in a way, as long as this war keeps going, Lukashenko is in a stronger negotiating position against the Russians. And as long as this war keeps going, then he's needed enough that the West can't really do anything, as in he's backed up by the Russians, and so the West can't box him in or try to bring his regime down. Point is, right now, he's probably one of the few leaders in Europe that, as he sees the war dragging on, he's not that particularly bothered, especially since so far he's been able to keep his country directly out of the war. Since there is a lot of indication that the Belarusian armed forces does not have much interest in sending troops inside of Ukraine. Anyway, I wanted to give you guys that background because without Putin, there is no Lukashenko. I wanted to give you an idea as to why he might be more excited for this war to go on a little bit longer, and why the Belarusian opposition sees his regime as tied to the war in Ukraine, even if he's tried to keep his participation lower than anything else than a launching pad. If Ukraine can launch a successful offensive, Putin will no longer have time for Belarus. I guess I will just call him the Belarusian partisan, said the group has been committing acts of sabotage against Russia in an effort to assist Kiev in the war, attacking Russian aircraft, damaging railways, and training Belarusian volunteers fighting along the Ukrainian armed forces. There are Belarusian volunteers fighting the Ukrainian armed forces. I know there's I think it's the Kalulishki regiment. I would have to go back and check. And there's a few others like fighting in the International Legion and such. In February of 2023, the group claimed responsibility for a drone attack that severely damaged a Russian military aircraft near Minsk. Azuru, a former Belarusian security services official, said he resigned from his job after witnessing election fraud in the 2020 presidential election and the heavy-handed crackdown of the protests that followed. He fled to Ukraine and eventually to Poland, from where he leads BIPOL. On February 15th, the Belarusian court convicted him in absentia, along with 5 other law enforcement officers for inciting social hatred, plotting to seize power forcibly, and creating extremist groups. Azuru received the harshest sentence, 25 years in prison and a hefty fine of around $123,500. Lukashenko, who has ruled Belarus since 1994, recently confirmed he would run for president again in 2025. My God, I wonder how that election is going to go. Guys have any idea who's going to win that? I don't know. A close ally of Putin, Lukashenko. I mean, is it going to be Lukashenko in just plain? Is it going to be Lukashenko in a funny hat? Is it going to be Lukashenko with an even funnier mustache? I mean, I don't know. It could be any number of choices. A close ally of Putin, Lukashenko, has stood by the Russian president, whom he considers an quote-unquote elder brother. Even though Lukashenko has for years been angling in order, obviously a political isn't going to include everything about this, for him to be the one that heads the union state between Russia and Belarus. He was the one who wanted to be top dog. It's part of the reason why he did the balancing act. Throughout his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he has allowed Putin to station tactical nuclear weapons on his territory, and Western states have condemned Belarus's involvement in the war in Ukraine, with the European Parliament calling Lukashenko an accomplice, which he certainly is, but that's all he wants to stay, and he wants to stay an accomplice for a very long time.